At 80 years old, Michael Douglas finally admits a truth he spent decades trying to bury. A truth not about scandals or betrayals, but about the silent suffering he endured behind the doors of a marriage the world believed was perfect. He speaks of nights when fame meant nothing, when even love could not shield him from fear, illness, loneliness, and the collapse of the man who once was. And for the first time, Michael Douglas confesses what it truly felt like to survive a life lived in the shadows of himself. And beside Catherine Zeta-Jones, Michael Douglas often says there are moments in a man's life that never leave him, no matter how many years pass. For him, one of those moments came late at night in 2010, long before the world knew how close he was to breaking. He had just returned from yet another doctor's appointment, exhausted, frightened, and unable to hide the piney in his voice. Catherine Zeta-Jones sat across the room watching with fear she didn't know how to express. Their marriage, which once dazzled Hollywood with glamour and her carpets, had quietly transformed into a battlefield of unspoken fears and unbearable pressure. That year, he was told he had stage 4 throat cancer, the kind of diagnosis that forces a man to confront everything he has avoided. Fame, money, applause, none of it mattered when the doctor said the words she still remembers with perfect clarity. And the truth he rarely admits is that it didn't fear dying as much as it feared what dying would do to his family. Catherine had already endured years off being hunted by tabloids, criticized for her marriage, and judged for every moment she stepped outside the world expected her to live in. Now she was being asked to carry a burden no wife is prepared for, the possibility of losing her husband at the very moment their children needed them most. Behind closed doors, their home grew colder, not because love faded, but because both were drowning in different kinds of pain. Michael fought for his life, while Catherine fought to hold herself together as her bipolar disorder turned with crushing force. Some days she sat with him for hours, whispering that they would survive this. Other days she would disappear behind a locked door, unable to bear the weight off watching him slowly weaken. And in those nights, Michael learned a truth he never expected, that the real horrors of a marriage are not loud, dramatic explosions. They're the silent hours when two people who love each other can no longer save each other. Long before illness entered their lives, Michael Douglas had already begun feeling the quiet erosion that comes when two people live under the weight of expectations too heavy for any marriage. From the outside, he and Catherine Zeta-Jones were the embodiment of perfection, the powerful Hollywood veteran, and the rising star whose beauty and talent made every camera turn. But fame has a way of magnifying small insecurities into fractures that no one sees until they break wide open. Their troubles didn't begin with cancer or bipolar disorder. They began with distance, physical, emotional, and professional. In the early 2000s, their careers pulled them in opposite directions. Catherine was filming in Europe, collecting awards, rising higher and higher. Michael was working in the United States, juggling film roles, producing commitments and responsibilities from the life he had built long before meeting her. Nights apart became weeks apart. Phone calls grew shorter, and unspoken doubts grew louder. Michael often recalled one conversation that haunted him for years. Catherine called him from Berlin, exhausted from filming, her voice trembling with insecurity she rarely showed. "Are you still awake?" she asked. "Or is someone keeping you awake?" It was a question born from fear, not accusation. The fear of marrying a man whose past she could never fully erase. Michael had been known as a womanizer long before he met her, and even though he had changed, his past remained a shadow she couldn't outrun. He told her he was alone, that it was past all that, but her silence told him she wasn't fully convinced. And Michael had his own fears, ones he never admitted. Watching Catherine's fame skyrocket, while he grew older, left him feeling like a fading figure beside a woman who was only becoming brighter. He loved her deeply, but he could not ignore the growing gap between who he was and who she was becoming. He once said privately that he felt like the world admired them as a couple, but inside he no longer knew how to keep up with her. Those were the early horrors, the ones no one talks about. Not betrayal, not anger, but the slow realization that love alone cannot silence the insecurities that fame plants inside a marriage by the time 2009 arrived. Michael Douglas had grown used to ignoring discomfort, a sore throat, a persistent ache, fatigue he blamed on long flights and late nights. But when the diagnosis finally came, Stage 4 throat cancer. Everything in his life fractured. That moment became the line between the marriage he once knew and the marriage that would challenge every part of his identity. He remembers coming home after hearing the news, watching Catherine Zeta-Jones play with her children in the yard, unaware that the world they built together had already shifted beneath their feet. He stood there trying to memorize the scene. Their laughter, the sound of Dylan calling for his sister, the warmth of late afternoon light, because he did not know if he would ever get to see that again. Telling Catherine was one of the hardest moments of his life. She froze and cried, but not because she feared becoming a widow. She feared the weight she knew she would need to carry. The press, the speculation, the expectation saw of being the strong wife. She had already battled her own storms, including the bipolar disorder that lurked beneath the surface, waiting for any emotional shock to erupt. Now she had to care for a husband who might not survive the year. Chemo began and Michael's world collapsed into a cycle of pain and quiet terror. His voice changed, his strength vanished, and the man who once commanded Hollywood found himself unable to climb a flight of stairs. Catherine stayed by his side for every treatment, holding his hand while he slipped in and out of consciousness. But as his body weakened, her illness resurfaced. Some days she sat with him for hours, whispering reassurance. Other days she withdrew entirely, locking herself away, overwhelmed by fear she could not control. Michael later confessed that the darkest part wasn't facing death. It was realizing he and Catherine were suffering separately, even while lying in the same room. They loved each other, but neither could rescue the other from the private terror consuming them. And for the first time, Michael understood that the true horrors of marriage are not found in betrayal or injury, but in watching the person you love break down while you are too weak to help them. By 2013, Michael Douglas had beaten cancer. But survival came with an unexpected aftershock, a marriage that no longer felt like Theo he had fought so hard to stay alive for. When the world saw him and Catherine Zeta-Jones walking red carpets again, smiling carefully for cameras, people believed love had triumphed over illness. But behind closed doors, the silence between them had grown sharper than any argument. Catherine's bipolar disorder had intensified during his treatment, and Michael had sunk into a deep post-recovery depression that had to hide behind interviews and public appearances. They were living under the same roof, yet drifting in opposite emotional directions. Nights once filled with whispered promises became silent, with both lying awake, staring into the darkness, wondering what had happened to the partnership they used to cling to. The breaking point came quietly. One evening in August 2013, Michael returned home to find Catherine packing a suitcase. She didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't blame. She simply said she needed to breathe. When he asked when she'd be back, she answered with devastating honesty. If there's still anything left to say, the headlines exploded. Michael Douglas and Catherine Zeta-Jones, separate after 13 years. But the real story was more painful than any tabloid could capture. For months, Michael wandered through his empty New York apartment like a ghost, unsure whether it failed her or whether they had both been destroyed by the very storms they tried to survive together. Catherine fled to Bermuda with their children, trying to rebuild her emotional strength, while shielding Dylan and Karis from the collapsing foundation of their family. Michael later admitted that the separation didn't break him. It clarified him. It forced him to confront a version of himself he had avoided for decades. A man who had spent more time trying to look strong than allowing himself to be loved properly. It exposed the raw truth that sometimes love doesn't vanish. It simply becomes too heavy to carry. And for the first time, without Catherine beside him, he asked himself the question he'd feared for years. Had he become the source of her suffering, or simply another casualty of it? The months of separation in 2013 forced Michael Douglas into a kind of emotional exile he had never experienced before. Hollywood had always given him roles where he was in control. Powerful men, men who made decisions, men who never faltered. But alone in his apartment, eating dinner in silence and reading about his family in tabloids rather than seeing them in person, he confronted something far more devastating than cancer. The realization that he had contributed to the collapse of his own marriage. During those months, he reread old letters from Catherine, notes from the early days of their love, lines filled with hope and fear in equal measure. One sentence struck him so deeply, he later recited it from memory. I'm scared the light around you will burn me, yet I still want to be near you. At the time, he had found the words romantic. Now understood that they were a warning. Catherine had stepped into his world carrying her own insecurities, her own demons, and instead of protecting her, he had let the intensity of his life push her deeper into those shadows. In January 2014, after months of silence, he finally wrote her a letter. Not an apology, but a truth he had never dared to tell her. I still believe in what we had done. A week later, her response arrived. Just 3 words. I haven't forgotten. 3 months later, Catherine walked through a door again. Not triumphant, not certain, but willing. She told him she wasn't making promises, only that she wanted to come home. And in that moment, Michael understood that reconciliation wasn't a victory. It was an agreement between 2 wounded people to stop pretending they were invincible. They lived quietly after that, without the fire of the early years or the chaos of the middle ones. Instead, they shared small routines. Coffee in the mornings, tending to the garden, talking about their children without the fear of breaking into an argument. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the Hollywood romance magazines try to sell, but it was real. And as Michael watched Catherine move through their home, still graceful despite the storm she had survived, he realized the most painful confession of all. He had loved her deeply, but he had rarely loved her the way she needed. By the time Michael Douglas turned 80, the storms had quieted, the scandals had faded, and the cameras no longer chased her with the same hunger. What remained was something far more honest. 2 people who had survived each other, survived illness, survived fame, and survived the versions of themselves they once tried to hide. Catherine Zeta-Jones, now 56, was no longer the Hollywood woman who he met in 1998. She had weathered her own breakdowns, learned to manage her bipolar disorder, rebuilt her identity, and risen again in projects like Wednesday. And Michael had learned to stop pretending he was still the invincible leading man. For the first time in decades, their home was quiet. With Dylan and Karis living on their own since 2021, the couple found themselves rediscovering what it meant to wake up without the noise of children, tutors, and schedules dictating their days. Michael admitted he feared the stage. He feared looking across the table at Catherine and realizing they had nothing left. But the opposite happened. After selling their Irvington estate for $12 million and splitting their time between Bermuda and Europe, they found themselves laughing more, talking more, and sharing a companionship that felt strangely new after 20 years of surviving crisis. In interviews, Michael has hinted at the truth he once hid. The real horrors of marriage were never Catherine herself. The horrors were the illnesses they carried, the pressure of fame, the crushing weight of public expectations, the insecurity of aging beside someone rising in the spotlight, and emotional bruises both inflicted without meaning to.